I parked the truck at the end of the street after 5 days on the road. I was tired enough to want nothing more than to fall face first onto the couch and not move until morning. But when I walked into the backyard, I saw her, Elise, my next-door neighbor, climbing over the wooden fence into my yard, barefoot, wearing nothing but a thin tank top and a pair of shorts. She turned, eyes wide when she saw me, and whispered, her voice shaking, "Please, let me stay at your place tonight." I hadn't even opened my mouth when I heard pounding on her front door. A man's voice, shouting, "My name is Everett Bryson. I am 34 years old, and for most of the year I make my living behind the wheel of a semi-truck, hauling freight across 5 states on runs that keep me gone 5 days at a stretch before I get 2 days back home to breathe. I live alone at 214 Larkspur Lane, in a quiet corner of Tulsa, Oklahoma, in the same house I bought 2 years ago, right after my divorce from Denise. We had no children together, which made the split simpler on paper, if not in the heart. The house had been mine before the marriage even started, bought with money I'd saved on my own. So when everything else got divided, that one thing stayed constant. It became the only place in my life that never changed shape, even while everything around it did. I'm telling you all of this now, looking back, already knowing everything that happened after that night. But at the time, standing in my own backyard with a stranger's fear written all over Elise's face, I didn't know any of it yet. All I knew was that the pounding on her door was getting louder, and that whoever was doing it sounded like he wasn't planning on stopping. I walked straight to the fence that separated our 2 yards and looked over. A man stood on her porch, fist raised against the door, calling her name like he had every right to. I don't scare easy, but something about the way he swayed on his feet, the way his voice cracked between anger and desperation, told me this wasn't a conversation. I called out, asked him who he was, told him it was time to leave. He looked at me, looked past me at the truck still ticking as it cooled down at the curb, and after a long moment, he turned and walked off into the dark without another word. I didn't know his name yet. Later I'd learn it was Wade. When I turned back around, Elise was standing behind the little gate I'd built into that same fence a few months earlier, still catching her breath, still halfway through a thank you she hadn't managed to finish. I didn't ask her anything else that night. I just held the gate open and said, "Come inside. You don't have to explain anything right now." Before that night, I would have told you I barely knew my neighbors. 5 days gone, 2 days home, over and over it doesn't leave much room for knowing anyone beyond a wave from the driveway. Most weeks, by the time I got back, I was too worn down to do much more than shower, sleep, and start getting the truck ready for the next haul. It wasn't a life I resented. It was just a life that had gotten small and quiet in a way I'd stopped noticing. I remember, 9 months earlier, Elise's car had died right in front of her house, one of the rare mornings I happened to be home between runs. I went over, popped the hood, got it running again. It hadn't meant much to me then, just a neighbor helping a neighbor. But standing in my kitchen that night, watching her hands still trembling around a glass of water I'd poured her, I understood there was something about her I hadn't let myself notice closely enough until now. It wasn't just that she was frightened. It was the way she kept glancing toward the window every few seconds, like some part of her still expected Wade to be standing there, even with him long gone from the porch. I didn't have a name for what I was feeling yet. I only knew I didn't want her to be that unsettled alone. I didn't ask who Wade was. I just told her, "Come inside. You don't have to explain anything tonight." I found a spare blanket in the hall closet, set it on the couch, and told her the bathroom was down the hall if she needed it. She thanked me twice, quietly, like she wasn't quite sure I meant it. I told her I did. The smell of diesel was still on my shirt from the drive. The new gate latch clicked shut behind us, soft against the porch light glowing gold over an otherwise silent yard. I lay awake longer than I expected that night, not because I was worried, but because for the first time in longer than I could remember, my house didn't feel entirely empty. The next morning, I slept later than I meant to, later than I had in longer than I could remember. 5 days on the road does that to a person it doesn't let go all at once. By the time I woke up, Elise was already gone, and the only sign she'd ever been there was a folded note on the kitchen counter, a short thank you with no name signed underneath it. I found something else, too. Out in the yard, near where she must have landed after clearing the top rail, a small brass whistle, half buried in the grass near the fence. I turned it over in my hand a few times, not knowing whose it was, and put it in a drawer in my workshop for safekeeping, figuring someone would come looking for it eventually. The weeks that followed fell into the same rhythm my life had followed for years, 5 days gone, 2 days home, except now there was something different waiting for me at the end of each run. Every time I pulled onto Larkspur Lane, it seemed like Elise was somehow already outside, tending to something in her yard, watering flowers that didn't need watering, like she'd been listening for the sound of my engine long before I turned the corner. I know now, looking back with everything I understand today, that I had it backward. I thought I was the one just now starting to notice her. The truth was, Elise had been paying attention to me for a long time before that night, longer than I ever gave her credit for. She'd learned the sound of my truck rounding the corner on Friday evenings. She'd noticed the porch light I left on a timer whenever I was away, glowing steady through nights I wasn't even home to see it. It wasn't that she fell for me the moment she climbed that fence. It was that she'd already been quietly following the shape of my life for the better part of a year, and when fear finally sent her running, some part of her had already decided, without needing to think twice, which direction to run in. We started talking more, standing at that fence every time I came home. Nothing heavy. Just the ordinary stuff, how her flower shop was doing that week, how long my latest haul had taken, whether the weather was going to hold. Neither of us brought up that first night. Neither of us mentioned Wade. It sat there between us, unspoken, the way certain things do when neither person wants to be the one to break something that's only just beginning to feel steady. Those conversations never lasted more than 10 or 15 minutes. But I started looking forward to them the way you look forward to the one part of a long day that actually feels like yours. She'd tell me about a wedding order that had nearly gone sideways, or a delivery van that wouldn't start, and I'd tell her about a snowstorm somewhere outside of Denver that had cost me an extra day on the road. It was nothing, really, on the surface. Small talk over a wooden fence. But I noticed how much I thought about those short conversations during the long, quiet stretches of highway in between. Replaying small details the way you replay something that matters more than it should. I started noticing things about her I hadn't let myself notice before. The way she always had dirt under her fingernails from the shop, no matter how many times she washed her hands. The way she laughed a half-second before she meant to, like it caught her by surprise every time. The way she never once asked me to explain the divorce, even though she must have heard some version of it from the neighbors by then. The way news travels on a street like ours whether you want it to or not. One evening, a few weeks in, I brought the whistle out to the fence and held it out to her. "You don't have to tell me," I said, sliding it across the top rail. "I just didn't want to keep something that clearly means a lot to someone." She looked at it for a long moment before she looked at me, like she hadn't expected to see it again so soon. Or maybe hadn't expected me to be the kind of person who'd bother keeping it safe. "It was my dad's," she said quietly. "He gave it to me before he passed." I didn't even realize I'd dropped it until I got home that night. There was a weight behind the way she said it, the kind that told me there was more to the story than she was ready to give me yet, and I didn't push. I just nodded and let her take it back into her hands like something precious finally returned. Not every evening at that fence was easy. Some nights I'd come home and catch her glancing at her phone, watching it buzz again and again on the porch rail before she flipped it face down without answering. She never explained it, and I never asked. I had a feeling it had something to do with Wade, some leftover thread from whatever had sent her running that first night, but I told myself it wasn't my place to pull at it. Not yet. Trust, I was learning, isn't built by demanding answers. It's built by sticking around long enough that someone eventually decides to give them to you on their own. There were nights I sat in the cab of my truck at some rest stop off the interstate, engine ticking as it cooled, and found myself wondering what she was doing back on Larkspur Lane, whether her porch light was on, whether that phone was still buzzing with whatever she wasn't telling me. I told myself it wasn't my business to wonder that hard about a woman I'd known less than a season. It didn't stop me from wondering anyway. I started timing my drive home a little differently after that, leaving a rest stop earlier than I needed to, just so I'd roll onto our street closer to evening, closer to the hour I knew she usually stepped outside. I never told her that. I don't think I fully admitted it to myself until much later. Looking back on it the way I'm looking back on all of it now. Somewhere around the 2-month mark, I put in a small gate right where that loose fence board used to sit, the one I'd never quite gotten around to nailing back into place. I told myself it was practical, easier than climbing over. But if I'm honest, some part of me knew exactly what I was doing. I was building a door where there hadn't been one before, and leaving it unlocked. By then, our 2 yards had developed a rhythm of their own. Friday evenings, when my truck finally turned onto Larkspur Lane, Her porch light and mine would both be glowing by the time I cut the engine, like the street itself knew we were both home. It became something neither of us said out loud, but something we both showed up for. Week after week, the quiet, steady proof that whatever this was becoming, it wasn't going anywhere. I think back now on how careful we both were during that stretch, how neither of us rushed toward the thing sitting right there between us. I used to believe that was hesitation. Now I understand it was something closer to respect for what had already survived one hard night, and for what neither of us wanted to break by moving too fast. Looking back, I can see it clearly now, the way you can only see a road once you've already driven it. Every wave across that fence, every 10-minute conversation about nothing in particular, every Friday evening porch light, was building towards something neither of us was ready to say out loud yet. I didn't know it at the time, but Elise did. In some quiet corner of herself she hadn't fully admitted even to herself. She'd been waiting a long time for a reason to stop just watching from a distance. She just hadn't expected the reason to arrive the way it did. In the dark, over a fence, with her heart pounding for two different reasons at once. 4 months after that first night, Denise came back to Tulsa. I hadn't heard from her in almost a year by then, not since the last of the divorce paperwork had gone through. And I'll admit that when her name lit up on my phone that afternoon, part of me assumed it was nothing more than a courtesy call, the kind exes sometimes make just to check the temperature of an old life from a distance. It wasn't that. Things hadn't gone the way she'd planned after the divorce. Whatever relationship she'd left me for hadn't lasted, and whatever job had taken her out of Tulsa hadn't panned out the way she'd hoped either. Money had gotten tight enough that she showed up at my door one evening, unannounced, wanting to renegotiate a deal that had already been settled, fair and legal, 2 years earlier. She stood on the porch, in the fading light, talking about hard times and second chances, and how surely I could understand her position, and I told her there was nothing left to discuss. The house had been mine before we ever got married, bought with money I'd earned long before I knew her name, and no amount of hard luck on her end was going to change what a signed agreement already said. She didn't take that well. I watched something shift in her expression, the kind of look I remembered from the last stretch of our marriage, right before things had started falling apart for good. She didn't leave Tulsa after that conversation the way I expected her to. She stayed in town, staying with a friend a few streets over, and it wasn't long before I started running into her more than I wanted to at the grocery store, at the gas station, once even parked near the end of Larkspur Lane like she was watching to see who came and went from my house. It didn't take her long to notice Elise. Denise had always been sharp that way, quick to read a room, quicker to read a man, and it wasn't hard for her to piece together that something had changed in my life since the last time she'd stood in that driveway. She saw the way I glanced toward the fence when I came home, saw the little gate I'd installed, saw the flower shop bucket sitting on my back step from the last time Elise had brought over a bundle of leftover stems. What I didn't expect was how far she'd go to use all of it against me. Somehow, through a friend of a friend who happened to know Wade from a bar he used to frequent on the north side of town, Denise learned about the night Elise had climbed that fence, the pounding on the door, the fear, all of it. It's a small enough town in some ways, especially once you start pulling on the right thread, and Denise had never had trouble finding the right thread when she wanted to. And instead of letting it be, instead of leaving something that clearly wasn't hers to touch, she turned it into a weapon, sharpened exactly where she knew it would cut deepest. She waited for the right moment, the kind of patience I remembered from our marriage, the kind she'd always saved for when it would do the most damage. It came on an ordinary Friday evening while I was unloading gear from the truck, a handful of neighbors close enough on the sidewalk to hear every word, their evening walks and dog leashes slowing down the way people's pace always does when they sense something worth overhearing. She said it loud enough that there was no mistaking who it was meant for. "You're gone 5 days a week, Everett," she said, her voice carrying further than it needed to. "You don't even know what happens here when you're not around. She rescued herself a dangerous man right next door, and you didn't have the first clue who he was." The words landed exactly where she meant them to. Not on my pride, but on the one fear I'd never said out loud to anyone, not even to myself in the quiet of the cab on long midnight drives. That fear that all those days on the road, all that time away, meant I was missing something important every single week, something I'd never get back, something that could hurt the people closest to me while I wasn't there to stop it. I looked over at Elise, standing near her own gate, and she didn't say a word in her defense. She just looked back at me, steady, waiting to see what I'd do, whether I'd ask her to explain herself right there in front of everyone, or whether I'd ask her to leave. Her silence should have told me everything. Instead, for one long, uncomfortable moment, it did the opposite. It let Denise's version of the story sit in the air a little longer than it deserved to. I stood there between the two of them, my hand tightening around my truck keys in my pocket, and for the first time since that first night, I felt the ground under everything we'd built start to shift. Denise wasn't finished. She kept going, painting a picture of a woman who'd shown up broken and desperate at my back fence and let me believe whatever story suited her, all while some dangerous ex-boyfriend lurked somewhere just out of sight, waiting for his next chance. She made it sound calculated. She made it sound like something done to me, rather than something that had simply happened to both of us. She reminded me, too, of every mile I'd logged on the road that year, every night I'd fallen asleep in a truck stop parking lot, 2 states away while my own street kept living a life I couldn't see. She knew exactly which fear to reach for, because she'd watched it grow in me for years before she ever left. Some part of me hated how well it worked, even knowing Denise the way I did, even knowing she had her own reasons for wanting to knock down whatever peace I'd found. I still felt the old fear rise up exactly the way she intended it to. 5 days a week, I told myself. 5 days a week, I'm not here to see what's really happening on this street, in that house, in the life of the woman I'd started, quietly, to care about more than I'd let myself admit. I want to be honest about that evening, because it wasn't my finest hour. I didn't storm to Elise's defense the way I wish I had. I stood there, quiet, caught between 4 months of trust and a fear 4 years in the making, and I let the silence stretch longer than it should have. Denise finally turned and walked back to her car, satisfied she'd planted whatever seed she'd come to plant. The street went quiet again, porch lights flickering on one by one, as the neighbors who'd been listening decided the show was over. Elise didn't say anything either. She just turned, walked back through her own gate, and closed it behind her, softly, like she didn't want to give me the satisfaction of a slammed door, even though I probably deserved one. I stood alone in my yard for a long time after that, the smell of diesel still clinging to my jacket, the wind picking up just enough to rattle the new gate latch against the fence post. I kept turning Denise's words over in my head, trying to figure out how much truth was buried inside all that anger, and how much of it was just an old wound looking for a place to bleed. That evening, after the street had gone dark and quiet again and the last of the neighbors had drifted back inside their own houses, Elise came through the gate I'd built, the same one I'd walked her through that first night. I could tell by the way she stood there, arms wrapped around herself despite the mild air, that she hadn't come just to check on how I was doing after everything Denise had said. She'd come to tell me everything, finally, all the way through, the parts she'd been carrying alone since before I ever knew her name. I offered her a seat on the porch steps, and for a while neither of us said much of anything. The porch light hummed faintly above us, moths circling it the way they always did that time of year. Finally, she started talking, her voice steadier than I expected, like she'd rehearsed this moment more than once in her head without ever meaning to. Wade used to be someone she was with, she said. Someone who drank too much and needed too much control over her, who kept track of where she went and who she talked to long after any of that should have been his business. She'd ended things with him nearly a year before that first night, but he hadn't taken it well, and every few months he'd resurface, calling, showing up unannounced, testing whether the door was still open even after she'd made it clear it wasn't. That night, he'd shown up angry, pounding on her door, and something in his voice had scared her enough that she stopped thinking and just moved. But when I asked her why she'd run toward my fence instead of anywhere else, a neighbor 2 houses down, her own car in the driveway, a phone in her hand that could have called for help, she went quiet for a moment before she answered, looking down at her hands like the answer embarrassed her a little. Even now. I heard your truck before I saw you, she admitted. I'd learned that sound a long time ago, longer than I probably should have, back before that night ever happened. Some part of me had already decided, without ever really deciding it out loud, that if I ever needed somewhere to run, it would be your yard. That's not something that came from being scared of Wade. That came from somewhere else. Somewhere I hadn't let myself look at closely until right now. I didn't need anything else after that. 4 months of Friday evenings at that fence, 4 months of porch lights glowing in matching rhythm, had already told me most of what I needed to know about who Elise was. What she said that night just gave the rest of it a name. put words to something I'd already decided in every way that mattered, long before I would have admitted it out loud to anyone, including myself. I went inside and made her a cup of coffee, mostly to give my hands something to do while I let everything settle. When I came back out and handed it to her, I told her plainly that nothing Denise had said out on that sidewalk changed how I saw her. Not one word of it. I told her I was sorry I hadn't said that sooner, out there in front of everyone, instead of standing there letting the silence do the talking for both of us. I called Denise before Elise had even finished that cup of coffee. I told her there was nothing left to negotiate, about the house or about anything else, and that I wasn't going to let her use a night that belonged to someone else as a weapon against a woman who'd done nothing to deserve it. She didn't take it well. She raised her voice, brought up old grievances that had nothing to do with any of this, tried a few different angles before she realized none of them were going to land. But for the first time since she'd come back to Tulsa, I didn't feel the need to soften anything I said. Some conversations only need to happen once, if you say them plainly enough the first time, and mean every word of it. Elise still tried to talk herself out of it. Even after all that, still trying to protect me from something she thought was entirely her own to carry. She said maybe it would be easier for me if she just stepped back, let things settle, kept some distance between our 2 yards until whatever Denise had stirred up finally died down on its own. She said she didn't want to be the reason my life got harder than it already was, gone 5 days a week, and now dealing with all of this on top of it. I told her the opposite was true. I told her that for the first time and longer than I could remember, coming home didn't feel like just another stop between runs. It felt like arriving somewhere that mattered. I used to tell myself I ran because I was scared of Wade, she said again, quieter this time. But some part of me had already decided, long before that night, that if I ever needed somewhere to go, it would be your yard. I told her. Then I'm glad I finally came home in time to hear it. We stood there a while longer, the new gate light casting a soft glow over both our yards, the smell of lavender drifting over from her side of the fence, my truck engine still ticking faintly as it cooled behind me. Nothing about that night felt dramatic or sudden. It felt like something that had been quietly true for a long time, finally being said out loud. 7 months passed after that night at the gate, and looking back now, I can see how naturally everything settled into place once we stopped pretending the rhythm between us was an accident. There was no single moment where things changed all at once. It was slower than that, quieter than that, built the same way I'd learned to build anything worth keeping one careful piece at a time. Joined so well, you could barely see the seams. Elise stopped hiding the fact that she listened for my truck every Friday evening. She started leaving the lights on at her flower shop, right around the hour I usually pulled onto Larkspur Lane. A small, steady signal that answered the same habit I'd kept for years without ever realizing anyone else was paying attention to it. Some evenings I'd catch her standing out front of the shop as I drove past. Not waiting exactly, just there. Like our 2 schedules had quietly agreed to meet in the same place at the same hour, without either of us having to say so out loud. My runs didn't get any shorter. 5 days out, 2 days home, the same as they'd always been. But the 2 days stopped feeling like a brief pause between one long stretch of road and the next. They started feeling like the whole point of the other 5. I spent most of my 2 days home each week in the workshop behind the house, and somewhere in the middle of that stretch, I started building something I hadn't planned on building. I hadn't set out with a clear picture of what it would become. I just found myself pulling a good piece of oak off the shelf one evening, running my hand along the grain, and before I fully understood what I was doing, I had the beginnings of a small box taking shape under my hands. It wasn't fancy, just clean lines and careful joints, the kind of thing I would have made for anyone if they'd asked. Except I hadn't been asked. Nobody had requested it. I worked on it in small pieces over several weeks, sanding a little more each evening I was home, staining it a deep honey color that caught the light from the workshop window just right. I carved her name into the bottom of it, quiet and small, somewhere she wouldn't notice right away, the same way you'd sign a piece of work you were proud of, but didn't need anyone to see right off. And inside, resting on a bed of soft cloth, I placed the brass whistle that had started this whole thing, the one that had been sitting in her father's memory since she was 19 years old. I'd kept it safe in that drawer for the better part of a year by then, and it felt right, finally, to give it a home that matched how much it clearly meant to her. I gave it to her on a Friday evening, the truck still parked at the curb, the engine barely cooled. I used to hate how much of my life happened on the road, I told her, setting the box in her hands. Now I just look forward to the drive back. She opened it slowly, and when she saw the whistle resting inside, I watched her hesitate for just a moment, like she thought maybe I was handing it back to her as some kind of goodbye, some kind of ending. It wasn't until she saw her name carved into the wood underneath it that her face changed, and she understood it was the opposite of that. It was a promise that no matter how many days I spent gone, there would always be somewhere for her to come home to, and she would never have to climb a fence in fear to find it again. The two of us built something steady out of all of that, month by month. She started keeping a spare set of clothes at my place for the mornings I got home too late to think straight. I started leaving the porch light on longer than the timer really needed, just so it would still be glowing whenever her shop closed for the night. Neighbors on Larkspur Lane got used to seeing both our yards lit up together every Friday, the little gate between our fences swinging open and shut so often that the hinge wore smooth from use. We fell into small traditions without deciding to. Sunday mornings, before I loaded up for the week ahead, she'd bring over whatever flowers hadn't sold from the shop, and I'd find a jar for them somewhere in my kitchen, even though I never had much of an eye for that kind of thing. She started teaching me the names of the ones she grew herself, patient with me even when I forgot them the following week. I started teaching her, in turn, how to read a weather map the way truckers do, watching for the systems that could turn a 5-day run into 6. There were harder nights too, the kind that come with any two people learning how to build something real together. A night when a longer haul than expected kept me out an extra day, and I could hear the worry in her voice on the phone even though she tried to keep it light. A night when an old friend of Wade's called her out of nowhere, just to say he'd heard she'd moved on, and she sat on my porch steps until the shaking in her hands finally settled. We got through those nights the same way we'd gotten through everything since that first one, slowly, honestly, without pretending they hadn't happened. Denise never came back to Tulsa after that. I heard, secondhand, that she'd moved on somewhere else, chasing a different life the same way she'd always seemed to be chasing something. I didn't feel anger toward her anymore. By the time the seasons had turned twice, I felt something closer to distance, the kind that comes when a wound finally closes over and stops being the thing you think about first each morning. Wade never showed up on that street again either. Whatever fear had sent Elise running that first night eventually faded into something she could talk about without her voice shaking, a hard chapter that belonged to a life she'd already moved past, not one that still had any claim on the life we were building together. By the time a full year had gone by, the fence between our 2 yards had stopped feeling like a boundary at all. It was just a line we crossed back and forth so often it barely registered anymore. The little gate always unlocked, the porch lights always finding each other every evening I made it home. I still spent 5 days a week on the road, hauling freight across state lines the same as always. But now, every single time I turned that last corner onto Larkspur Lane, I knew exactly what I was driving toward, and it had nothing to do with the house itself anymore. Looking back on all of it now, I still remember that first moment, clearest of all, Elise's hand reaching out through the dark of my backyard, not to beg for pity, but as the quiet result of a year spent watching my life from a distance, waiting for the one night she'd finally have a reason to cross that fence for good. Denise left Tulsa not long after, and somewhere along the way, I stopped thinking of her as an open wound. She just became a closed chapter, one that made room for a better one to begin. There's something I've come to believe since that night. Something I don't think I understood back when I was still just a tired man climbing out of a truck after 5 long days on the road. Some feelings don't need to be spoken the moment they're born. They just need someone patient enough to notice them and kind enough friendled to ask before the moment is ready. I spent so many years measuring my life in miles and mile markers that I nearly missed the one thing quietly waiting for me the whole time, right on the other side of a fence I'd never gotten around to fixing properly. She didn't just climb that fence because someone was pounding on her door. She climbed it because, somewhere along the way, she had already decided my yard was the one place in the world she trusted enough to run to. Have you ever quietly noticed someone for a long time before they ever realized it? And if you were me, after 5 exhausting days on the road, would you have opened that door the same way I did, without asking a single question first? If this story meant something to you, leave a like, subscribe so you don't miss the next one, and tell me what you would have done in the comments below.